Part 11, Roman Commonwealth by Stephen Spiers. Copyright 2018. Looking at the royal warrants issued during the sweeping changes made by the Whitlam government, you can clearly see that the wording is different. This corresponds to the newly created oaths of allegiance, the renaming to an Australian government, a new national anthem, and oaths of office. Here on the first letter, left, we can see that it says, "Whatsoever that shall pass the Great Seal of Australia," followed by "Our Court at Government House, Canberra," and "Our Executive Council." In the second letter, right, you can see similar, where it says "Our Court at Government House," followed by "For our Government of Australia," and "Great Seal of Australia." The second letter then goes on to state that the seal shall be used as a royal great seal, in sealing all things whatsoever, other than things that shall pass the great seal, that bear our sign manual, as well as defining our ministers of state for Australia. So we have a great seal being defined as a royal great seal that can sign more than it can initially sign. And previous, in 1954, we had a Great Seal and Lower Seal issued to Queen Elizabeth II. So we had two seals, whereas now we have one that performs two jobs. Previous to this, Edward VII and George V had Great Seals of the realm, and then the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Australia issued in his name as the Commonwealth of Australia formed a part of the realm. The initial Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Australia is first defined in Letters Patent 1900, as we have discussed. This defined that the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Australia fell under the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the realms of the Imperial Crown. Now we have a newly issued Great Seal of Australia under Queen Elizabeth II, under the title of Queen of Australia, wherein this Great Seal has the power of a Royal Great Seal, wherein allegiance is to the nation state and constitution rather than to the realms of God. Question then is what defines the issue of the Great Seal of Australia previous to the royal warrant giving its issue. It surely seemed as if a parliament of wizards was at play, slowly chipping away to change the foundations of the Commonwealth of Australia at the Constitution itself. It was so simple to change the Constitution Act at Clause 5 at a time of war. The excuses given in the best interests of the people of the Commonwealth of Australia legitimised a foreign power's ship of war legal access into the realm. Adopting Section 4 of the Statute of Westminster Act 1931 UK in the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942, c, with opened the door for this foreign realm to set foot into the states, creating trust territories, and through the years post-coronation under the St. Edward's Crown, and seen the debt double, the currency change, the flags change, and under Gough Whitlam the entire structure of government replaced by oath of allegiance from the top down. The removal of the definitions of what was foreign to the realm are removed, and the new position of the Australian government takes seat in the realm. No longer merely embedded in the executive reaches of the Constitution, it is now front and centre as a nation-state of the United Nations, changing the oath of allegiance to be reflective of subordinate to the nation-state, and not unto the realms of God, like the Governor-General by oath of allegiance to the realms of the St. Edward's Crown.
Before we have a look at the changes made in the Australia Act 1986, which stems from the powers in Section 4 of the Statute of Westminster Act 1931 UK, adopted in the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942 Commonwealth, we look at Bob Hawke, who was Prime Minister at the time of the signing of the Australia Act. Being a Fabian, Bob Hawke addressed the 100th anniversary of the Fabian Society while he was in the office of Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia. The next 9 or so pages are the transcript of the speech Bob Hawke gave at this 100th anniversary gathering of the Fabian Society at Melbourne, Victoria, on the 18th of May 1984.
Melbourne, 18 May 1984. For any association or secular institution to reach its first century is noteworthy and, in our times, remarkable enough in itself. That alone would be sufficient reason for us to join together tonight in this celebration of the centenary of the Fabian Society, brought into formal existence in London 100 years ago this month. And incidentally, I trust it will be noted in the appropriate quarters that those of us here tonight, associated with the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Labor Government, have been so far able to overcome our notorious prejudices as to celebrate a British centenary and a British institution, indeed, in many respects, a quintessential British institution. But seriously, I invite you all to consider the wider and deeper significance of this achievement, because it goes far beyond the Fabian Society's mere survival in the technical and temporal sense. For tonight we are marking the centenary of the Society, and an idea which, of its very nature, could not at its birth be thought to have had much chance of survival at all, much less survive into the very end of the 20th century. For this was and is the most difficult thing of all to maintain, a political association. It was founded as, and remains, a purely voluntary association of like-minded men and women, bound by no dogma or creed or fixed body of doctrine, and able to offer its members inducement or rewards, or to impose discipline or enforce rules, an association based entirely on moral and ecological ground, and by the very essence of its nature and purpose, having only the loosest structure and formal organisation. Further, the century since 1884 has been the most turbulent and eventful in human history, a century of tremendous change in human attitudes and standards, a revolutionary era in which no political or social or economic assumption made a century ago has gone unchallenged, and few, if any, have not been fundamentally changed. Yet the Fabian Society and its original ideals endure. That a society so conceived could survive in such a century and survive with continued vigour is surely striking testimony to the enduring strength of the cause with which it has been so closely identified, and to which it has contributed so much, the cause of social democracy. I deliberately use the words "the cause" with which it is identified, because the Fabian Society did not and does not claim to be a cause in itself. Rather, it was called into existence to represent and promote an idea and an ideal, and, most important, a method, an approach by which that idea could best be implemented, and by which the ideals of social democracy could be given practical effect. And almost from the beginning its founders envisaged that the vehicle would be a Labour Party, long before the British Labour Party as such existed. Sidney Webb, one of the founders of the Fabian Society, and for so long its presiding genius, described the process in this way. From 1887 the Fabians looked to the formation of a strong and independent Labour Party. We did all we could to foster and assist, in succession, the Independent Labour Party, then the Labour Representation Committee, and then the Labour Party. But we also set ourselves to detach the concept of socialism from such extraneous ideas as suddenness and simultaneity of change, violence and compulsion, and atheism or anti-clericalize, nor did we confine our propaganda to the slowly emerging Labour Party, or to those who were prepared to call themselves socialists, or to the manual workers, or to any particular class. So, from the beginning, the Society drew its strength from the vision of the future of Labor and the Labor Party. But beyond its fundamental strengths, many factors have contributed to the strength and survival of the society. First, we cannot ignore the personal element, that extraordinary galaxy of political, intellectual, and literary talent which made up the firmament of Fabianism. The Webbs, Graham Wallas, George Bernard Shaw, then latter Tom Mann, who helped introduce Fabianism to Australia. Then later on again, people like Bertrand Russell, G.D.H. Cole, Harold Lasky, and R.H. Hornsey. Many may think that, in terms of his contribution to Fabian philosophy and social democratic thought, Hornsey was the greatest of them all. Certainly his great work Equality stands as the definitive exposition of the true meaning of the social democracy, both as an ideal and a practical program. Another source of the society's strength was what we may call the mythology of Fabianism, the primacy given to facts, knowledge, proper research, and solid information as the basis for action, whether political, social, or economic action. It was the recognition, as Beatrice Webb put it, that reform will not be brought about by shouting. What is needed is hard thinking. And the third and greatest and most enduring source of the influence of Fabianism was the idea of practical relevance. And this is the very essence of Fabianism. It is the recognition that the commitment to democracy and democratic means is fundamental. It is the recognition that this fundamental commitment imposes on social democrats obligations and restraints in terms both means and ends. It is the recognition, as I myself put it in the Resolution of Conflict Lectures, the Boyer Lectures in 1979, of the need for those who would advocate change to temper their favour with a sense of gradualism. And it cannot be emphasised too strongly or too often that this approach is not a matter of mere pragmatism. It is equally a matter of principle. It is a principle which follows inexorably from our commitment to democracy, and it is a principle which lies at the very heart not only of Fabianism but social democracy throughout the world. And it is, of course, the classic concept of Fabianism, the inevitability of gradualness, and nothing is more widely misunderstood or more frequently misrepresented. It was never conceived as a justification for opportunism. It was and is a principle of necessity. The principle was first and best propounded by Sidney Webb himself, speaking as President of the British Labour Executive at the Party Conference in 1923. He said, "Let me insist on what our opponents habitually ignore, and indeed what they seem intellectually incapable of understanding, namely the inevitable gradualness of our scheme of change. The very fact that socialists have both principles and a program appears to confuse nearly all their critics." Webb continued, "If we state our principles, we are told that is not practicable. When we recite our program, the objection is that is not socialism. But why? Because we are leftists? Should we be supposed to be idiots?" From the Labour Party it must be plain socialism is rooted in democracy, which necessarily compels us to recognise that every step towards our goal is dependent on gaining the assent and support of at least a numerical majority of the whole people. Thus, even if we aimed at revolutionising everything at once, we would necessarily be compelled to make each particular change only at the time, and to the extent, and in the manner which 10 of 15 million electors in all sorts of conditions, of all sorts of temperaments, from Land's End to the Ormkeys, could be bought to consent to it. That was Webb in Britain in 1923. It is relevant and true in Australia in 1984, for it represents an unchanging truth and a fixed principle for the Labor Party and Social Democrats everywhere. And I repeat and emphasise, it goes beyond pragmatism. It is the principle which flows from our fundamental commitment to democracy. I suppose there is no greater hero in the pantheon of radical reforms than Aneurin Bevan, who was also a great Fabian. He was never accused of selling out or selling the cause short. He was never denounced as an opportunist or derided as a pragmatist. 30 years after Webb's analysis, which I have just quoted, Bevan wrote this magnificent confession of his faith. The philosophy of democratic socialism is essentially cool in temper. It sees society in its context with nature and is conscious of the limitations imposed by physical conditions. It sees the individual in his context with society and is therefore compassionate and tolerant, because it knows that all political action must be a choice between a number of possible alternatives it ensures, all absolute prescriptions and final decisions. Consequently, it is not able to offer the thrill of the complete abandonment of private judgment, which is the allure of modern Soviet communism and of fascism, its running mate. It accepts the obligation to choose among different kinds of social action, and in so doing to bear the pains of rejecting what is not practicable or less desirable. It seeks the truth in any given situation, knowing all the time that if this be pushed too far, it falls into error. Its chief enemy is vacillation, for it must achieve passion in action in the pursuit of qualified judgments. It must know how to enjoy the struggle, whilst recognising that progress is not the elimination of struggle, but rather a change in its terms. In this brief review, I have said enough to indicate the spirit, ideals, methods, and objections of the society whose centenary we celebrate tonight. I have so far referred only in passing to its Australian contribution as part of its general contribution to the cause of labour and social democracy. But Australian Fabianism and Australian Fabians have made a specific and significant contribution to the Australian labour movement and the Australian Labor Party. The circumstances in which the Society of Australia has operated have, of course, differed considerably from those of the parent body. So too has its role. The Australian Labor Party is many years older than the British Labor Party. Our parliamentary success came much earlier and has been much more consistent than that of the British Labor Party. That early and consistent success, combined with our historic origins in the trade union movement, meant an emphasis on practical achievement above theory and doctrine. And indeed, the Australian men and women of the 1980s and the early 1900s had already recognised the inevitability of gradualness and applied in its practice, at a time when for the British Labor Party it was merely a statement of principle for future Labor governments yet to be elected. The future difference in the role of Fabianism in Australia lay in the nature of our federal system, and I mean not only the federal nature of the Australian Constitution, but the federal structure of the Australian Labor Party itself. It may even be that the comparative success of the society in Melbourne relative to other capitals reflected something of our colonial past. It certainly established Melbourne in its role as the headquarters of the radical tradition in Australia. But despite the differences, Fabianism has made a valuable and enduring contribution to social democracy in Australia in both thought and action. Fabian societies were formed here as early as 1896. The Frank Crean has recalled the present society, the Fabian Society of Victoria, now, I am pleased to say, properly named the Fabian Society of Australia, was formed in 1947. And of course, that was a very significant year in the history of the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Labor movement. It hastened to say that I'm not suggesting that importance derives anything from the fact that 1947 happened to be the year I joined the Labor Party in Perth. But the year 1947 represented both a high tide and a turning of the tide for post-war Labor and for the Chifley Labor government. It was for the movement as a whole a year of great opportunism and enthusiasm and achievement. The work of post-war reconstruction was going on apace. Full employment was established as a national principle and a national goal. But 1947 was also a year when the challenge against bank nationalisation forced us on a realisation of the restrictions and restraints imposed by the Constitution and in particular by Section 92. Consequently, this led to the rethinking of our approach, because unless the platform was just to stagnate into irrelevance, the search had to be made for alternative means of achieving our objectives. And in that search, it was a search and a development of policy that went on for more than 20 years. Fabians were in the forefront, Fabians like Frank Crean, Jim Cairns, Kim Beazley, Race Matthews, and not least our own Fabius Maximus, Gough Whitlam himself. Throughout the long years in the wilderness, the Society played a valuable role in producing and disseminating information and ideas and in promoting dialogue. It preserved the Fabian tradition of research as a basis for reform. There were times in the bitter years after the split when the Fabian Society seemed almost a lone voice for sanity, civility, realism, and genuine idealism amongst us in Victoria. But above all, the ongoing importance of Fabianism in Australia has been to help bring to our movement and our cause that quality which I said before was the essence of social democracy, the need for a sense of relevance in the application of our ideas and our ideals to practical purposes and achievable goals. And in this I gladly acknowledge the debt of my own government to Fabianism. Earlier, I dealt at some length with the principle of the inevitability of gradualness. There was another important idea, a method more than a principle, which became closely associated with Fabianism. Sidney Webb called it permeation. Today, it would be called consensus. Webb put it this way: most reformers think that all they have got to do in a political democracy is to obtain a majority. This is a profound mistake. What has to be changed is not only the vote that is cast, but also the mental climate in which Parliament and the government both live and work. That I find to be an accurate description of the approach I and my colleagues have tried to bring to the affairs of this nation in our first term of office, from the National Summit on which we attempted to transform the atmosphere of politics, the background, the assumptions, the shared information and the perceptions of common goals through which decisions can be made, not just by the government and Parliament, by key groups and interests like business and unions. Of course, there are some who will misunderstand or misrepresent the nature of this approach and the meaning of consensus. It was ever thus. Beatrice Webb described in her diary of their Melbourne visit in 1898 a meeting with people whom she only identifies as some Victorian socialists. From her unflattering description, clearly not members of the Labor Party and Rights. Sidney tried to explain the Fabian Society of permeation, with the result that the chairman, in his concluding remarks, recommended the meeting be adopted, Mr. Webb's suggestion of taking the capitalist down a back street and then knocking him on the head. We all have to face the fact that if our government is to make really great and worthwhile reforms, reforms will endure, reforms that will permanently change this nation, then it is not enough simply to obtain a temporary majority at an election or even successive elections. For our reforms to endure, the whole mood and mind and attitudes of the nation must be permanently changed. Certainly, we are proceeding to implement the policy on which we were elected and the platform of the party with which thoroughness, I believe, not excelled by any previous Labor government in its history. But that specific task must go hand in hand with the more general and deeper, longer range task, the task of establishing in the mood and mind of this nation permanent acceptance of the naturalness and inevitability of change and reform as the authentic Australian way of life. And that, for the first time in our history, is what that Labor government is attempting. Let me conclude. An occasion like this serves to bring home to us all one of the great truths about our cause in Australia, the cause of labour and social democracy, and that it is continuity of our movement and the continuity of our role in our nation. The party itself is 100 years old in 1991. The Labor movement is already well over a century. One of the great paradoxes of Australian politics is that the parties and forces of conservatism and reaction, for all their self-proclaimed loyalty to tradition, have no real continuity and no real sense of continuity. And without a sense of continuity, in the case of individuals or parties or movements or nations, there can be no true sense of identity. And I believe it is precisely because our adversaries lack that sense of their own continuity and in their deep sense their own identity, they are obliged to seek it outside themselves, in other institutions and even other nations. And that, I believe, explains, at least in part, much of their current conduct, their lurches, not only in search of a policy, but in search of an identity. It is, by contrast, our own sense of continuity as a government, a movement, a party, a cause, which provides us with this ability and strength to overcome the countless setbacks we have suffered and, equally, in the days of triumph, to live up to the motto set for itself by the Fabian Society 100 years ago. For the right moment we must wait, as Fabius did most patiently when warring against Hannibal, though many censured his delays. But when the time comes, you must strike hard, as Fabius did, or your waiting will be in vain and fruitless. Before we get into the Australia Act per se, we must digress. We are still looking at what is going on with the royal arms of three realms, pushing three lineages of authority into a Commonwealth that is supposed to stream down from its constitution under the authority of only one of those realms and kingdoms. We have seen that the Government Gazette changed in 1925 before any changes were made to the British Empire at Imperial Conferences 1926. Alongside the Lord Balfour Declarations 1926, and how they impacted changes by the UK Parliament by Royal Styles and Parliamentary Titles Act 1927, followed by Royal Styles and Titles 1927 of King George V. Preceding the changes by 2 years and previous to the conferences related to the actual change is a very key point. We have seen through the change of the flags and the adoption of the Flags Act 1954, given Royal Sign Manual by Queen Elizabeth II, demonstrates that the authorisation of the blue ensign bearing 7-pointed white star in Lower Canton is linked to military orders of 1908, ordered a change from 6-pointed star in Lower Canton to the 7-pointed star. We have also seen how the Commonwealth of Australia, through its change in currency, including the addition of the 7-pointed star at the end of imperial silver and the beginning of decimal dollar tin. And we have seen how warfare impacted the Commonwealth of Australia after the Lord Balfour Declaration 1926 and Imperial Conference 1926, leading to the division of the empire into separate holy bodies based on the core faith and realm of the imperial crown. Now we have a new realm in the St. Edward's Crown, Queen Elizabeth II heading the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Australia and Canada and her other realms and territories. This is important. The Queen has other realms. Could the Queen hold the imperial crown in trust as King George VI had put trust territories under the United Nations in the Nationality and Citizenship Act 1948? Is it possible that the St. Edward's Crown is merely in administration of the former imperial crown? But here we have a sneaky change to the Constitution again, following what the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942 had adopted in the Statute of Westminster Act 1931 UK, wherein, as Clause 4, requests and consent would still be a valid form of interacting with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in contradiction of Acts Interpretation Act 1966, wherein the United Kingdom is defined as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. We have had the ability to sever the motherland on several occasions since Constitution, most not realising the separation between warfare and politics. Falling under a realm brings the authorised King James Bible to the foreground and leaves politics to the background. Once declarations of warfare are made, the lead is handed to the Commander-in-Chief. What then of Letters Patent 1984, removing the role of Commander-in-Chief from the Governor-General? We will have a look at this as the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, Peter Cosgrove, takes his tenure in office, being the former head of the Australian Defence Forces and for many years. The Australian government seemed to be severing links with the United Kingdom, but if you look a little closer to what is happening post-Imperial Conference 1926, the Commonwealth of Australia, under the failing financial climate, is attempting to adopt the United Kingdom back into its line of authority. In the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942 Commonwealth, the then Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia adopted Clause 4 of the Statute of Westminster Act 1931 UK, opening the loophole to make requests of the UK Parliament. We can see by this letter from the Department of Constitutional Affairs that the Australian Government has stated that the Act abolishing the then remaining legislative, executive and judicial links to the United Kingdom. This is proven wrong in many ways, given the track through the declaration of war by Prime Minister Robert Menzies against Germany in 1939. On the other side of this, the Australia Act 1986 was requested through the states, given consent, and then requested through the Commonwealth to the United Kingdom for consent. The Australian Government requested actions in the United Kingdom Parliament on behalf of the states whom requested it of the Australian Government. But here we have the state of New South Wales displaying a coat of arms that isn't linked to its root of its authority, shown to, through Clause 5 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act July 1900 UK/PGA, have subverted the line of authority within the Constitution itself. If a state that has been changed at its root core of authority is now making requests of the Australian Government, which through the actions of secret meetings with the Queen saw an overhaul in the change of oaths of allegiance, Parliament, office, as well as a national anthem, we have to consider what is causing the Australia Act 1986 to be requested through the states of the Commonwealth of Australia in the first place. The Australia Act 1986 would never have come about if it weren't for the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942, opening for requests and consent to be sent to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Declarations of warfare in 1939 had brought about a host of issues and possible headaches in relation to the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act July 1900 UK/PGA and the core of the realm under the Imperial Crown. We can see how a coat of arms introduced to Government Gazette in 1925 before Imperial Conferences 1926 had been involved, through New South Wales at least, in making requests for consent in the Australia Act 1986 in the first place. The Australia Act 1986 was touted by many as the defining moment when Bob Hawke sold the country out from underneath the people. It separated the powers of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland from the Commonwealth of Australia and transferred the powers to the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia, or at least we thought. The first line of the Australia Act UK 1986 says it all. An act to give effect to a request by the Parliament and Government of the Commonwealth of Australia, the United Kingdom giving a big hint that two entities are at play. If you look a little deeper into what is going on, this becomes quite evident. Have a look at the United Kingdom's Act below. I will comment between each of the acts that I have displayed below. Australia Act UK 1986, 1986 Chapter 2. An act to give effect to a request by the Parliament and Government of the Commonwealth of Australia, 17th February 1986. Whereas the Parliament and Government of the Commonwealth of Australia have, with the concurrence of the States of Australia, requested and consented to the enactment of an Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom in the terms hereinafter set forth. Be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons, in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, as follows. 1. No Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed after the commencement of this Act shall extend or be deemed to extend to the Commonwealth, to a State, or to a Territory as part of the law of the Commonwealth, of the State, or of the Territory. 15. 1. This Act, or the Statute of Westminster 1931, as amended and in force from time to time, insofar as it is part of the law of the Commonwealth, of a State, or of a Territory, may be repealed or amended by the Act of the Parliament of the Commonwealth, passed at the request or with the concurrence of the Parliaments of all the States, and subject to subsection 3 below, only in that manner. 15.3. Nothing in subsection 1 above limits or prevents the exercise by the Parliament of the Commonwealth of any powers that may be conferred upon that Parliament by any alteration to the Constitution of the Commonwealth made in accordance with section 128 of the Constitution of the Commonwealth after the commencement of this Act. 16.1. In this Act, the Commonwealth means the Commonwealth of Australia as established under the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. The Constitution of the Commonwealth means the Constitution of the Commonwealth set forth in Section 9 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900, being that Constitution as altered and in force from time to time. 17.1. This Act may be cited as the Australia Act 1986. 17.2. This Act shall come into force on such a day and at such a time as the Secretary of State may, by order made by statutory instrument, appoint. This, however, doesn't seem to be the case. The preamble of the Australia Act 1986 Commonwealth is completely different to the Chapter 2 enacted by the Queen by royal assent under Queen of Australia under the St. Edward's Crown. It is to be noted that the real Act of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Parliament mentions two entities, that of the Parliament and Government, and the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia is a legal body under Section 9 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, July 1900 UK/PGA. So it must be the Australian Government, a second entity, that has created the following Act. Australia Act 1986 Commonwealth. An act to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the states into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Whereas the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth and the Premiers of the states at conferences held in Canberra on 24 and 25 June 1982 and 21 June 1984 agreed on taking of certain measures to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the states into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation of all the states have, and whereas in pursuance of paragraph 51 XXX VIII of the Constitution of Parliaments requested the Parliament of the Commonwealth to enact an act in the terms of this act. Be it therefore enacted by the Queen and the Senate and the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Australia as follows. 1. Termination of power of Parliament of United Kingdom to legislate for Australia. No act of the Parliament of United Kingdom passed after the commencement of this act shall extend or be deemed to extend to the Commonwealth, to a state or to a territory as part of the law of the Commonwealth, of the state or of the territory. 16. Interpretation. 1. In this Act, unless the contrary intention appears, the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act means the Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom known as the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. The Constitution of the Commonwealth means the Constitution of the Commonwealth set forth in Section 9 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, being that Constitution as altered and enforced from time to time. 17. Short title and commencement. See Note 1. 1. This Act may be cited as the Australia Act 1986. 2. This Act shall become into operation on a day and at a time to be fixed by proclamation. Note 1. The Australia Act 1986, as shown in this compilation, comprises Act No. 142, 1985, amended as indicated in the tables below. Australia Act 142 of 1985, 4th December 1985, date of commencement. A. The Act installed by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was then followed by a commencement order as per Section 17 of the Act, put through the United Kingdom's Parliament. This was also given consideration and consent under the Spiritual, Temporal and Commons as a part of UK parliamentary procedure. As can be seen, the Act was put before the Parliament on the 27th of February 1986. The Australia Act 1986, Commencement Order 1986. In pursuance of Section 117(2) of the Australia Act 1986 A, I hereby make the following order. 1. This order may be cited as the Australia Act 1986, Commencement Order 1986. 2. The Australia Act 1986 shall come into force on the 3rd of March 1986 at 5 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time in the morning. The Commencement Act also of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Parliaments is pretty straightforward. The Australia Act 1986 was to be put into force on the 3rd of March 1986 at 5 a.m. So a Parliament sat and discussed the Act and then put in an order for the commencement of that Act at a very specific time to Greenwich Mean Time. Now let's look what happened in Australia. Australia Requesting Consent Act 1985, number 143 of 1985. An act to request and consent to the enactment by the Parliament of the United Kingdom of an act in the terms set out in the schedule of this act. Assented to 4 December 1985. The Parliament of Australia enacts, whereas the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth, of the Premiers of the States at conferences held in Canberra on 24 and 25 June 1982 and 21 June 1984, agreed on taking of certain measures to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Be it therefore enacted by the Queen and the Senate and the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Australia as follows. 1. Termination of powers of Parliament of United Kingdom to legislate for Australia. No act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed after the commencement of this Act shall extend or be deemed to extend to the Commonwealth, to a State or to a Territory, as part of the law of the Commonwealth, of the State or of the Territory. 17. Citation and commencement. A. This Act may be cited as the Australia Act 1986. This Act shall come into force on such day and at such time as the Secretary of State may by order made by statutory instrument appoint. The Australian side of the Australia Act started with request from each state to the Commonwealth of Australia. As can be seen in the Australia Acts, this occurred after conferences held by the Prime Minister's Office and the Premiers of the states on the 24th and 25th of June 1984. A Request and Consent Act was created after the States and Commonwealth agreed on all requests and was given assent by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth on the 4th of December 1985. What seems to be legitimate request to the Crown and the UK Parliament at Westminster would surely have waited for the UK Parliament to make its verdict in response and install the Australia Act as law. This, however, does not seem to be the case. The preamble to the Australia Act 1986 Commonwealth is completely different to Chapter 2, enacted by the Queen by royal assent. It is to be noted that the real Act of the UK Parliament mentions two entities, that of the Parliament and Government, and the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia is a legitimate body under Section 9 of the Constitution Act. So it must be the Australian Government, a second entity, that has created the following Act. Australia Act 1986 Commonwealth. An Act to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Whereas the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth and the Premiers of the States at conferences held in Canberra in 24 and 25 June 1982 and 21 June 1984 agreed on taking of certain measures to bring constitutional arrangements affecting the Commonwealth and the States into conformity with the status of the Commonwealth of Australia as a sovereign, independent and federal nation. Of all the States have and whereas in pursuance of paragraph 51 XXX VIII of the Constitution, the Parliament requested the Parliament of the Commonwealth to enact an Act in the terms of this Act. Be it therefore enacted by the Queen and the Senate and the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Australia as follows. 1. Termination of power of Parliament of United Kingdom to legislate for Australia. No Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed after the commencement of this Act shall extend or be deemed to extend to the Commonwealth, to a State or to a Territory as part of the law of the Commonwealth, of the State or of the Territory. 16. Interpretation. 1. In this Act, unless the contrary intention appears, the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act means the Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom known as the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. The Constitution of the Commonwealth means the Constitution of the Commonwealth set forth in Section 9 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act, being that Constitution as altered and enforced from time to time. 17. Short title and commencement. See Note 1. 1. This Act may be cited as the Australia Act 1986. 2. This Act shall come into operation on a day and at a time to be fixed by proclamation. Note 1. The Australia Act 1986, as shown in this compilation, comprises Act Number 142, 1985, amended as indicated in the tables below.